Labor demand. So last lecture we studied the long run labor demand and other issues, and then hiring quota. And today we will start with the minimum wage. So you have seen this diagram, right? The last lecture. So it shows the trend of minimum wage in Korea. Okay, so what we were interested in here is it's just the theory of minimum wage. Okay, so in this case, let's assume that labor market is perfectly competitive. So we have labor supply curve and labor demand curve, and this is the equilibrium. So W0 is the market wage rate, N0 is the employment level determined at the market. So let's introduce minimum wage to this diagram, assuming universal coverage. So universal coverage means that everyone is subject to the minimum wage. So you work, then no matter your condition, you are supposed to get at least the minimum wage. Okay? So what happens? What happens here is that minimum wage will be determined at first above the W0. Okay? If it's below W0, then it obviously has no effect. So for the minimum wage to have any effect, it should be higher than the market wage. Okay? So something like this, WM. Okay? So what happens? Labor demand changes from point E to what? Labor demand? Point A, right? Falls, basically. Okay, so the labor demand was N0, now it's ND. Okay, it's simply because they have to pay the higher wage, and labor demand curve is downward sloping. So for the price go up, demand falls. Okay, so obviously the supply is likely to increase to NS. Okay. So for example, these group of people had a reservation wage between W0 and WM. So for W0, they had no intention to work, but if they work, let's say they can get WM, so they have, they now expect a higher wage in the market. So comparing their reservation wage, they decide to work, to look for jobs. Okay, so demand falls, supply increases. Okay. So what happens? What happens here is that theoretically it's pretty obvious that there will be unemployment, meaning that people who are willing to work up to NS, but there are only ND jobs available. So ND to NS will be the number of people who will be unemployed. Okay. More specifically, if you look at ND to N0, that is the people who lose their jobs because of the minimum wage. N0 to NS are people who enter the labor market who are not previously working, but now they enter the labor market, so they look for jobs. Okay. So what we can say about it is that theoretically, when the minimum wage is enforced above the market wage rate, then we will have lower employment, and those lower employment comes from basically here that people losing their jobs. Okay, so what can happen is that some employers who previously hired, let's say, 3 people in their store, now they want to hire only 2 people, okay, because of the higher minimum wage. Okay, so these are the so labor demand decreases, labor supply increases, unemployment increases. Actually, when the market is at the equilibrium, there is no unemployment. Okay, everyone who wants job, everyone who wants to work gets work. Okay, that's at the equilibrium. Now that we have unemployment and minimum wage, who get benefits from the minimum wage? Obviously, if you retain your job, under the minimum wage, then your wage is higher. Okay? So obviously you will benefit. Okay? So this policy creates losers and winners. Okay? The winners are these people who retain their jobs under the minimum wage. Okay? Now who are the losers? Who loses? Who loses? Who doesn't like this policy? The first group must be what? Firms, employers. Okay, employers who hire minimum wage workers. They wouldn't like it because they have to pay the higher wage. Okay? So that is obviously one group that would lose because of this policy. The other group must be what? Well, there must be so those who become unemployed, okay, because of the higher minimum wage and lower demand. Okay? So if you retain your job, you're fine, but if you're not, then you're gonna be jobless. Okay? So that is the theoretical discussion. It's very simple theoretical discussion that what happens if the minimum wage is enforced with universal coverage. But there could be another case which has the limited coverage. Okay, what is the limited coverage? So here what we can assume is that, let's say there are two kinds of market, two kinds of jobs. One job is under the minimum wage law. The other job is not under the minimum wage law. Okay, for example, in Korea's case, up to November 2000, minimum wage was not universal. Okay? If you work for a very small employer, let's say that hires 5 or less people, like convenience stores, like now they hire only 1 or 2, probably at most 2, I guess. These jobs, okay, the employers of those stores, they did not have to pay the minimum wage. They could pay lower than the minimum wage because they were considered to be too small, but it was up to 2000. Okay? From 2001, they should pay the minimum wage, even if you hire only 1. But let's assume that, let's think of such case. Okay? So basically the same kind of jobs, but big stores pay the minimum wage, small stores do not pay the minimum wage. They pay only the market wage. Okay? So think of the effect. Okay, before the minimum wage, so everything is competitive. Okay? If everything is competitive, for here we have SC and DC, and we have SU and DU. So, okay, this is covered sector. This is uncovered sector. So these are big stores, and these are small stores. Okay, before the minimum wage, most likely they will pay the same wage because there is a competition between big store and small store for employees. So at the end, they should pay the same wage. If big store pays the higher wage than smaller stores, then smaller stores will have a problem in hiring workers. So they have to pay the higher wage. So at the end, they should the workers should get the same wage. So that is, let's say, W star. That is the pre-minimum wage level market wage. So everyone gets the same wage. So EC was employment level, and EU is the employment level. Okay? No, EU here. Okay. The middle. Okay. Okay, then what happens? Let's say in the covered sector, the government enforces the minimum wage, which is this. Okay? So big stores, now they have to pay higher wage. Okay? So what happens? Okay. So first thing that can happen is that there will be people who lose their jobs here. Okay? So that's like E bar to EC. Okay? And these people may try to find new jobs in smaller stores. Okay? So big stores, there is no job available. So they go to smaller stores and then try to find jobs. Okay? So in this market, what happened is that this labor supply curve now shifts to the right, simply because there are many more people who are looking for jobs. So it shifts to the right. Okay? What happens? Wage falls. Okay? Employment level increases. Okay? Wage falls. So in the uncovered sector, the wage will be lower than the pre-minimum wage level, okay? And employment level will increase. Okay, that's okay. But there is another possibility. So what kind of possibility? Another possibility is that let's assume that minimum wage is pretty good, okay? And then there is actually pretty good chance to get a job at the minimum wage, let's say. So then if you're a worker in the uncovered sector, in the smaller store, you figure out that, oh, if I stay in the smaller store, okay, my wage will be much lower than, than the wage level that I can get in the bigger ones. Okay? And then there is a, let's say, fair chance to get a job there. So the idea here is that, okay, I think I should try to get a job at the bigger stores. Okay, not staying here, but let's go there and then try to find jobs. So then what happens here? Labor supply does not increase, but decreases, because these people will try to find jobs there. Okay? So in that case, actually this sector, the wage may increase as well. And the employment level decreases because obviously labor demand will not change, so wage goes up, so employment level falls. And this type of movement you can think of actually pretty logical way. So think of the workers' idea about the wage level at the covered sector. So first thing is that if they get a job, they can get the minimum wage, WM. Okay? But there is a possibility that you may not get the job. Okay? So the expected wage is like a probability get a job at WM. Okay? So let's say if it's a 50% chance, okay, and minimum wage is, let's say, $10, then the expected wage is like $5. Okay, if you try, you may get a job 50%, and the minimum wage is $10. So it's $5. Okay, let's say you are paid $7 at the uncovered sector. Then these workers figure out that, okay, that may not be a good idea to go to uncovered sector and try to get a job, which has only $5 expected wage, but I get $7. If that's the case, then it's likely that supply curve shifts to the right. Okay? But let's say you are paid $4, but in the covered sector you can get expected wage is $5. So $10 times 50%. Then the workers will figure out that, okay, it's actually worth a shot, okay, to get the job at the covered sector. Then the supply curve shift to the left. Okay? So this movement will happen as long as this expected wage is different from the market wage at the uncovered sector. If they are equal, then nothing happens. Okay, I mean the movement stops. Okay? So that's what I just said. Okay. So at the end, the expected wage in the covered sector will be equal to the market wage in the uncovered sector. Okay? So if the expected wage is higher than the market wage in the uncovered sector, then supply movement happens from uncovered to the covered. And if expected wage is lower than the market wage, then movement happens from covered to uncovered. Okay, get that? So theoretically, actually, there is not much of debate on what happens if minimum wage changes as long as the market is perfectly competitive. Oh. Then how about the effect? Okay, obviously the theory says that employment will decrease. It shows, it gives you direction of the effect, but it does not tell you the size of the effect. Okay? The size of the effect is obviously dependent, for example, like elasticity of demand or elasticity of supply. Most likely, elasticity of demand is pretty important. Okay, if you look at the diagram. So there has been lots of studies on what's the effect of increasing minimum wage on employment level. The study has long history, and most of the studies find that increasing the minimum wage has a small negative effect on employment. Okay? So it decreases employment, it seems, but the effect is not as big as you may think. Okay? So that is I would say that there is a general consensus, the small negative. But the one thing is that this study comes mostly from the U.S. Labor market studies. Okay, so we have some studies on Korean labor market, but we don't have many studies on that, because one reason is that our minimum wage history is pretty short. Okay. Okay, so in the textbook, from page 120 to 125, that's the section 3-9, I think. Yeah, 3-10, and then in the middle we have evidence subsection 120 to 125. This is if you read these carefully, then you can find out that what kind of debates has been on the effect of minimum wage, and there has been some surprising studies. Okay, so one study cited here is that actually they find the positive effect of increasing the minimum wage on employment. But that study has been actually under so much attack, so I think that study is not well received now. Yeah. But anyway, so you know that there is a minimum wage discussion right now going on in Korea. Okay? In Korea, the thing is that the minimum wage is not in the U.S. Minimum wage is determined by the law. They have to change the law. They have to go through the Congress to change the number. But in Korea's case, we don't go through the Congress. What we do is that we actually have a minimum wage council, okay? And 27 people. Right? So this council determines the minimum wage, and we change the minimum wage pretty much every year. Okay? In the U.S., for example, it's much more difficult to change the minimum wage, obviously, because they have to go through the Congress that has, the opposing ideas. So usually their minimum wage changes infrequently, like every a few years. Okay? And sometimes it doesn't change like more than 10 years. But in Korea, we change almost every year, and then they are now starting the discussion of the next year's minimum wage. It will be determined by law around June, I think. In June, the council is supposed to announce the next year's minimum wage by June this year. And so they are, and then now this year there has been lots of discussion about it, because you probably know our finance minister, okay, publicly announced that they want to increase the minimum wage by a larger percentage than usual, and the labor union side is trying to get very large number. So that's going to be interesting. Okay, so yeah, I mean it's a good thing to follow. So please read this section about the empirical evidence, especially if you're interested in the current policy discussion about the minimum wage. It's good. It's a very good section to read. Okay. And another thing about the minimum wage is that there is another type of debate whether the minimum wage is really an effective policy to help the poor. Because if you think about it, the minimum wage is not targeted to poor specifically. Because the minimum wage applies to everyone. It doesn't ask whether you are rich, whether you are poor, whatever, right? If you, let's say, you are from very rich family, let's say, so let's say you don't have much money. What you want is, let's say, buying a new iPhone or something, okay? So you have plenty of money, but I need something extra that my parents do not want to give me. So what can I do? Okay, I can get a job. Okay, at a convenience store, I can get the minimum wage. Okay, so those group of people can get the minimum wage because the minimum wage is not a welfare policy. It does not ask you, okay, what qualifications you have. Right? It doesn't ask your family background. Okay. So there has been a discussion about whether the minimum wage actually helps the poor. Okay, the assessment, I'm not going to go through much detail, but there is a brief discussion on our textbook page 125 to 126, and there has been actually in something in Korean data that a lot of people who get the minimum wage are not actually poor. Okay? So especially the teenagers, lots of young group of people do take the minimum wage jobs, and they found out that lots of teenagers who get the minimum wage are not necessarily from poor background. Okay? So whether the minimum wage is a really effective policy, okay, that's another issue. Okay. Some may say that minimum wage is a blunt tool. Blunt means it's not sharp. Okay, so it's blunt. So when it hits when try to hit the spot, it actually doesn't hit the spot only. It hits everybody. Okay, so in a way, it may not be the very effective policy to help the poor. Okay? But in a way, the minimum wage is preferred by the politicians because it is much easier to enforce. You don't have to find money, right? If you try to get more welfare benefits, and people talk about raising tax and all those things, but the minimum wage seems to be free. You just raise the minimum wage, and employer, okay, do something. Okay, find your way. Okay? So it seems like it's much easier policy to enforce, but we should not be fooled by that. Obviously, learning economics, we know that there are hidden negative effects on the economy, like losing employment, all those things. Okay, so for the minimum wage, actually, we will have another model of minimum wage later when we learn about the non-competitive labor market. But let's stop about our discussion of minimum wage for now at here. Okay, now let's move on to the next topic, next subject of labor demand, adjustment costs. What we mean? Okay, if you think of the labor market model, so far when you think of changing the employment level or labor demand, okay, we assume that you can do it with a very fast speed. Okay, it doesn't take time. We didn't think of the time taken to change the employment level. But if you think about it, in reality, changing the employment level from the employer side, it takes time, and there are costs. Okay, what kind of costs? Okay. So not only the wage, but there are costs. For example, if you want to, let's say, increase the number of employees, okay, you hire more people. Okay, first thing, you have to pay the cost of hiring exercise. For example, like probably you have to advertise the vacancy. Okay, so you have to tell, people that we have vacancy. Okay, so some big companies may use like newspapers or other things. Okay, also you have to go through application process and selection process. You have to like interview them. You have to assess them. Okay, and then you have to select them. Okay, and it costs money. Okay, obviously that large companies pay very large amount of cost for this selection process. Okay, it takes long time, okay, and costly. And if you have new employees, you have to hire them. You have to train them. Okay, so usually, like for example, like cost of hiring trainers and preparing the training materials, and if you try to teach them, somebody should do it, and these people, these teachers, okay, maybe your regular employees who cannot work, okay, for at least for that period of the time. Okay, so disrupted work because for the new employees. Okay, so these costs are involved. And for other costs, like cost of administrative work and paperwork, etc., etc. So if you think about it, let's say you're a boss of a company, you want to hire new people, you have to think of these costs. Okay, it's not free. Okay, you cannot just pick anybody on the street, right? You have to do all these things necessary. Okay? So it's obviously that it's going to be very difficult to hire constantly, okay? Because you probably don't want to spend too much money on this. Okay? But it depends. Okay, later we will talk about it in more detail. Now, when you reduce the number of employees, let's say you lay off somebody. Okay, it's not free. You cannot, just, I mean, sometimes it's not that difficult, but in many cases, okay, it has some cost. First thing is that severance pay. Okay. So some countries have this law, okay, that require the employers to pay extra compensation if you lay off your employees. Okay. It could be usually a few months of salary, okay, like 3 months, 6 months. Okay. It may not be required, but some, by some conventions, okay, employers do give those benefits to their employees. So obviously it costs money. And then also that for the remaining employees, you have to adjust their work schedule. Okay? So that will be another type of cost. And psychological impacts. Okay? So let's say you lay off some people, obviously it may have negative effect on your morale of your employees. Okay? They may be worried about their future. Okay? They may start to look for jobs elsewhere. Okay? And their efficiency may drop because they spend too much time in worrying about and trying to find new jobs. So that also involves the costs. Okay? So as you can see here, that adjustment, so we call these costs adjustment costs. It just means that when you adjust your workforce, you have to pay the costs. Okay, not just the wage. There are extra costs involved in increasing or decreasing your workforce size. Okay, that is the adjustment cost. Okay. So before we didn't talk about it, but in more realistic model, we have to think of these adjustment costs. Okay. Another thing about the adjustment cost is maybe fixed or variable. Fixed variable just means that fixed costs are the incurred regardless of the size of adjustments. So whether you hire a lot or whether you hire a few or whether you let go lots of people or whether you let go just a small number of people, okay, these costs are fixed. For example, like you have, let's say, personnel department, okay, and these costs are fixed. Okay? So even if you don't hire anybody, okay, or even if you don't lay off anybody, still this personnel department should be run, and it costs you money. So those type of costs are fixed costs. And for example, like advertisement costs, okay? So you advertise for a vacancy. Even if the vacancy number is small or large, usually costs the same, okay? So those are fixed costs. And variable costs, obviously, like cost of training new employees, okay? So if you have a large number of new employees, then you have to find larger facilities, you know, all these things. It's variable. So that is the variable cost. So here, what you can think of is that given these fixed and variable adjustment costs, how the employers consider this adjustment cost and then decide what to do. Okay. So what happens here is that think of the adjustment costs and benefit. Okay. So the red one are the adjustment costs. Okay. And this blue one is the benefit of adjusting the size of the workforce. Here we assume that, let's say, the costs are variable. Okay? So as you can see, the adjustment size increases and costs increases. Adjustment size decreases and costs also increases. Okay? So red one shows the variable adjustment costs. Okay. So, and then benefit, you assume that it is just a straight line. So marginal benefit is the same. Okay? So what happens here is that the cost, the marginal cost is increasing. In a sense, it means that if you adjust only a small number of people, the marginal cost is low. Okay? So if you hire, let's say, only a few, and then you put them into the workplace, okay, it does not cost you much for the additional person. But if you get more and more, bigger number of people, okay, the cost gets higher and higher, the marginal costs. Okay? And the same thing about the reducing the number of workers. So for example, like effect on morale. Okay? So if you let go only one or two, or let's say a few, probably it doesn't affect the morale of the remaining employees. But if you let go like 100 people at the same time, then your employees will be really worried. So the marginal costs are likely to be pretty large. Okay? So in this case, what happens here is that depending on the benefit and cost, the employer, cost should be around here. The employer, okay, should look at whether the benefit exceeds the costs. Okay? As you can see that the range that benefit exceeds the costs are here. Okay? So what we can say is if the adjustment costs are mostly variable, it makes sense to make adjustments in small quantities, not in large quantities. Okay? So for example, you don't want to let go like 200 people at the same time. You probably want to let go like 10 people at a time, but it takes time. It takes longer time. Okay? And in this case, the same. You don't want to hire 1,000 people at the same time. You probably want to hire a small number of people in chunks, small chunks. So it takes more time. Okay? So in this case, so as you can see, that this is the time to adjust. Okay? So let's say this is your desired level of final employment. So you have E0, you want to hire A0 people. Okay? How to get there? Okay? So as you can see from this diagram, it makes more sense to do adjustment in small quantities. So it takes time to get there. Okay? You cannot just jump. Okay? I mean, you can, but you don't want to do it because it costs too much. Okay? And for reducing the number of workers, the same. Okay? You don't want to hire, you don't want to lay off too many number of people at the same time. You want to lay off little by little and then get the desired level later. So it takes time. Okay? In this diagram, since the marginal cost of laying off is bigger than the marginal cost of hiring, it takes more time to reduce the number of workers than to increase the number of workers. So if you are a company that has this mostly variable adjustment costs, usually these companies try to hire or lay off people in small quantities, but much more frequently. Okay? Now compare it to the case where the costs are mostly fixed. And as you can see that it makes sense now to change the number of workers in this region and this region, not this region. Okay? So what you do not hire or lay off people in small chunks. Just do it instantly. Okay? So let's say you have to hire only, let's say, 10 people. You don't do it. You wait until, let's say, your need gets bigger, let's say, to 500 people. Then what you do? You hire 500 at the same time. Okay? Do not do it like a 50, 50, 50. You just do it 500 at one go. And here, laying off, same thing. You do not want to lay off, let's say, 10 people at a time. You want to just lay off 200 people. Okay? You just close the whole department. Okay? One day. Right? So in this type of case, usually the adjustment will happen infrequently, okay, but at a bigger size. Okay? So depending on how the adjustment cost is structured, so if adjustment costs are mostly variable and the marginal costs are increasing, employers will change the employment level incrementally, okay, little by little, taking time. But if adjustment costs are mostly fixed, employers do not change employment level unless the necessary change is big enough. Okay, if they switch immediately to a different employment level, but it happens infrequently. Okay? So if you are in a job market, then you look at their hiring policies. Some companies have this hiring policy. They, some companies hire people pretty much constantly. Okay? Then you can say that, okay, their costs are probably mostly variable. Okay? They do not have like a big personnel department. They usually have very small number of people dedicated to, or they probably do not have any person whose job is only to hire or, manage the workforce. Okay? And these companies are likely to do this constant hiring exercise. And some companies do it infrequently, like once a year. In lots of Korean big companies do this hiring exercise, okay, once a year only. Okay. And those companies are likely to have very fixed, okay, large fixed adjustment costs. For them, it makes more sense to do exercises at the same time and just, do it only once a year. They don't want to pay the cost constantly. Okay. Makes sense? Okay. So this hiring hiring practice can be explained by the concept of adjustment costs. Okay. Okay, now related with the adjustment costs is the employment protection legislation. What is the employment protection legislation? It's a law that tries to protect employment. Mostly, not mostly, but all, obviously, the employment of the workers. Okay? So, for example, one thing you can think of like a severance pay. So if you lay off some people, okay, you have to pay the extra cost. Okay, let's say you have to pay them 2 months, 3 months salary, 6 months salary, let's say. Okay? But obviously, when this severance pay goes up, then the cost of laying off people will go up. Okay, They may have not only the severance pay, they may have some type of requirement, process requirement. You have to, for example, like prove to the government that you have tried everything before laying off these people. You have to go through a certain negotiation process with the labor union, all those things. That is obviously, that takes much time, and it's costly from the employer's point of view. Those are the type of employment protection legislation. Okay. In some cases, you are not. Some cases, that you have no freedom to lay off people unless these people are at fault. Okay, these people probably committed some type of serious error in their work, or they did something illegal. Then you may, laying off these people. Unless you cannot do that. Those type of things, that all the laws that tries to protect employment of workers, we can call it the employment protection legislation. Okay. So in Korea's case, there is lots of talk about this as well, So in the government talks about this labor market structural reform. Okay, when they talk about this labor market structural reform, what they think of a lot is this labor employment protection legislation, because in Korea's case, it's not that easy to lay off people. Okay. One extreme is that, for example, in the U.S., they are famous for their employment at will policy. So traditionally, the U.S. labor market has this employment at will practice. That means there is a proverb. You can fire somebody for good reason, for bad reason, or for no reason. Okay, that's the U.S. idea. Okay, you don't like him, you just lay him off, just fire him. You don't have to explain why. Okay, so if you watch a U.S. movie, that happens, right? One day, this guy gets fired from the job, and the reason is that he probably did something, I don't know, offensive to the employers, or he did some bad mouth their employer, and then he just gets fired. Okay, and it's in the movie, right? They accept it. Right? They do not, try to go to the court or whatever. Right? There's, I got fired, and then something, happens. They may, do things. So that's kind of U.S. Idea. Okay, so in the U.S., the employment protection level is pretty low, you can say. But in some cases, actually, I went to a seminar, and then they say that this practice, employment at will practice, in reality, it's not that easy. Okay, in some states, actually, there are lawsuits about all these things, but that's legal detail. But their principle is employment at will, but there are exceptions. In Korea's case, you cannot do that. In Korea, if your boss do that to you, okay, you have to sue that person. Okay, you go to the court and you will win. Okay, if your boss fire you only because let's say, I don't know, only because he doesn't like what you wear. But anyway, okay, they cannot do that. Okay, so those kind of things are different. So the countries, each country has different level of employment protection. So there's been lots of debate about this, whether Korea has very strong protection or weak protection, whatever. Okay. But theoretically, if you think about it, it's pretty easy. Employment protection legislation increases the cost of firing people, cost of reducing the number of employees. That's what it means. What it means is that employment protection will decrease layoffs. Okay, so if you have strong employment protection, the laying off people will be quite costly. So there will be smaller incidents of fewer incidents of layoffs. Okay, so since they know that they have to retain the workers for a long, long time, they probably have to train them better, right? Because if you keep them, so then it's better to make them good, okay? You cannot just replace them. So they have an incentive to invest more in their employees. Okay, it seems like pretty good, but there are negative sides. One thing is employment protection may decrease the effort level of the employees because they are not likely to be fired. Okay? So probably they find it, okay, I don't have to work very hard to keep this job. Okay? As long as I do not make serious mistake, no, I'll be okay. So probably their effort level is lower. So there is a study about this, and then they find that the effort level is actually really low. I mean, theoretically, it is likely to be possible. Nobody wants to work really hard. If you can get the same pay for less work, why not? Okay, so that may be the negative side. Right? And there is a more serious problem. Employment protection, I said that it will increase the cost of firing. Not only that, it also increases the cost of hiring as well. Why? It does not directly affect the cost of hiring, but if you think of the employers how they think, it should. Why? Because let's say you hire people, you know that these people will be with you for a long, long time. What you would do? You will be very, very careful in hiring people, right? It will cost you more money. You will go through much more thorough process of hiring and training, okay? So it will increase the cost of hiring. There is another problem, obviously, that because you cannot fire people even if your business goes bad. Let's say your business goes bad, okay? So in the US, for example, what happens? Usually the first thing they do is that they lay off somebody, okay? They just shut down whole department, shut down the office, shut down factory. Okay, that's what happens, for example, like when the US auto industry was pretty bad, they shut down lots of factories in Detroit, okay? And that's one reason why the Detroit is in such trouble, even now. Okay? But here, you cannot do that. Okay? So what it means is that when you hire people, you have to think of this cost as well. Okay? There is expected cost of not being able to fire people even if you need to. Okay? So you don't want to hire too many people. If you're really worried about, okay, this business may be not as good as today, in 5 years, it can be pretty bad. Okay, so since you cannot fire people, or you can fire, but after very large costs, paying the large costs. So there will be so the employment protection will decrease new hires by the firms. Okay, and new hires will be much more difficult to find their jobs, and these people are more likely to be young people who enter the labor market for the first time. Okay. So workers who already have jobs, they have pretty well protected jobs. But the new hires will be much more difficult. Will find it much more difficult to find the jobs. Okay. So that's the logical conclusion of what is the effect of employment protection legislation. But also that there is a negative side and positive side. So employment protection decreases fluctuations in employment over the business cycle. So when the business cycle goes good, let's say there is a boom, they want to increase hire, but they will not increase hire too much because they're worried about the recession in the future. The recession hits, okay, then people should be laid off, but not many people because of the strong protection. So the employment level will be much more stable than the countries where the employment protection is pretty weak, like the US. Economy recession hits, lots of people will lose their jobs, just just overnight. They will become jobless. But when the economy, gets better and goes boom, then lots of people will find jobs. Okay? But in the countries where the employment protection is very strong, that does not happen. You're not likely to lose jobs much, but you are not likely to find new jobs much. So it's a positive side, negative side. And the economy goes bad, it seems like pretty positive thing. But when the economy goes good, then it seems like pretty negative thing. Especially it becomes a problem for the young people because they are at disadvantage because they are not, their jobs, obviously they have no job to protect, so that it's going to be much more difficult to find new jobs. Okay, and then another effect is the employment protection induces the employers to shift their new hires to unprotected workers. Okay, so if there is a way to hire people with less protection, the employer will try to do it because it's less costly. So let's say like a fixed-term employees. Okay, you hire people you do not hire people under regular contract, but under less fixed-term contract. You have only 1 year or 2 year. Okay, so after that, they may not rehire these people. Okay. And in the long run, the employer obviously will substitute capital for labor. Why? Because this increasing employment protection just increase the cost of labor. It does not apply to machines, right? So in the long run, employers have an incentive to substitute capital for labor because labor got more expensive. As you can see, that employment protection legislation can be very controversial because if you already have a job, it's good to have this protection. Okay, if you do not have your job, okay, it can be quite problematic if you find it very difficult to find your jobs. But on the other hand, they probably want to have protected jobs if they can find a job. Okay, so there is lots of things. So the reason why the Korean government officials are talking about the labor market structural reform is related to all these issues. Okay, if you think about it theoretically, strong employment protection can have pretty negative effect on the employment level overall. Okay? But actually, if you look at the literature, the labor market literature, it's not clear whether the employment protection actually decreases the overall employment level. Obviously, because there are positive side and negative side. Negative side is that new hires will be difficult to find their jobs. So in that sense, overall employment will be lower. But on the other hand, people who already have jobs are not likely to lose their jobs. So in that sense, the employment level may be higher because of employment protection. So there is no clear-cut theory that whether the overall employment will increase or decrease because of employment protection. Okay? But one thing that it seems supported by the evidence is that youth employment, young people employment are likely to be lower in places where the employment protection is strong. Okay. So in some cases, they try to solve this problem by lowering the level of employment protection. For example, Germany actually did that in some time ago. The mini job, mini job is like unprotected, like worker jobs. Okay, so those things, they try that kind of reform. Probably the Korean government is thinking about those things. Anyway, the theoretical discussion about this is very related with this, current affairs. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the workers versus hours. What? Now, when you think of labor demand, at the beginning, when he said is labor input is number of hours times number of workers. So in the sense, we did not have any distinction between workers and hours. Okay, hiring, let's say, one more person or making your existing workers to do extra work that equivalent to one person's work, no difference. But in reality, it's not true, right? Because some costs vary by the number of workers or by the number of hours. For example, there are costs per head. So if you increase the number of workers, there is extra cost. Hiring people. You know, if you ask your workers to work longer hours, you don't have to hire anybody, so you don't have to pay the higher cost. Or training cost, you know, your existing workers, you don't have to retrain them, okay? But you hire new people, you have to train them. And some employee benefits are per person, not per hour, okay? So let's say you give like a, for example, I don't know, some type of, let's say, in Korea, lots of companies, I think they give meal subsidy to their employees, right? Your lunch is on your employer. That's obviously the per head cost. Okay? So whether your workers work for 6 hours, 8 hours, they eat one lunch. They work for 4 hours. Okay? So those are the per head cost. Per hourly cost is obviously the hourly wage paid, right? You ask your workers to do extra work. In a lot of cases, actually, you have to pay overtime. Okay, by law, the overtime must be at least 50% more than the regular pay. So that is hourly cost. So when the employer think of whether to, let's say there is a boom in the business. There are lots of more orders than before. So you have to put more labor into your work. So one decision the employer has to make is to, should I make new hires? Or should I ask my existing workers to work for longer hours? Okay. And you know, when you reduce the labor input, the same question. Okay? Whether should I lay off some people, or whether should I just ask my workers to work for shorter hours and probably pay less because they work for shorter hours. Okay? So that is the question that we ask. Okay? So per head cost is closely related to the adjustment cost we just talked about. Okay. Okay, and actually the answer is pretty similar because if you think pretty obvious. If you think of the labor input now into two components, number of people and number of hours, and each has their own cost. So what you have to do is the marginal cost of person should be equalized to marginal cost of hour. Okay? So the marginal cost of person increases, then what? You have to substitute hour for person. So for example, like increase the per worker cost, let's say the mandatory health insurance benefits. Let's say the government says that, what you have to do is now you have to give some type of extra health insurance to your employees. Okay, so let's say new regulation made, or as I said, the adjustment cost increases. Whatever the cost that increases the per head cost, then substitute hour for workers. Okay, it's lay off some workers so to save money, okay, and increase the working hours of remaining workers. Yeah, that makes more sense, probably. And they may increase the per hour cost. Okay. So something like overtime premium. Okay. So let's say overtime premium was 50%. Let's say they make it into, 55%. Okay, now letting them do overtime costs more money. So what they do, they substitute workers for hours. So some employers may not, so they reduce the number of hours and they hire more people. Okay, can happen. So this substitution are likely to happen, but some in the short run, at least in the short run, they may not happen because the relationship between machine and workers, okay, that may be a constraint on what can they do. about the substitution. Okay? So think about this. If your goal, let's say, as the government, if your goal is to increase the employment level, meaning that number of people who have jobs, so what you can try? You can try actually this, right? So you increase the per hour cost of the employers. Then the employers respond by substituting workers for hours. Okay? So you increase the overtime premium from, let's say, 50% to 55%. Then employers probably think, okay, we have to hire more people, so we have to finish more work in regular hours, so that we can save money in the overtime. Okay? So that is likely, that seems to be a pretty good idea when you try to increase employment. Okay? So there is lots of interest in this, and there has been actually study about it. What study? Work sharing. What is the idea of work sharing? The work sharing is the reduce the regular hours of work. Okay, so when you have overtime, okay, overtime kicks in when they finish the regular hours of work, like 40 hours. If you work 42 hours, 2 hours is the overtime. Okay. Now, if you reduce the regular hours of work, okay, for example, like say on average, workers do work, let's say 42 hours. Okay, so 2 hours is overtime, 40 hours regular. Okay, but let's say the government says, okay, from now on, the regular hours is not 40. Let's say it's 37. So 37 hours is regular. So if you do work 42 hours, you have 5 hours overtime. From the employer's point of view, it basically increases the cost, right? Because you paid only 2 hours of overtime. Now you have to pay 5 hours overtime. Okay. Okay, and then what can they try? They can try to hire more people and try to reduce the number of hours they work, right? So not letting them to work for 42 hours, they probably ask them to work only 39 hours, 2 hours extra, like before. But then they hire more people because they need more people to finish their jobs, right? So that's the idea of work sharing. And allowing firms to pay less per workers, meaning that if you actually if you ask the workers to work, if they ask the firms to pay too much, they will hire less. So anyway, so the work sharing idea works like this. And this work sharing idea has been pretty popular in Korea, actually, quite a few years ago. Now, I think we can hear about the work sharing from time to time. It's very interesting. Okay, this idea has been actually quite popular, especially in European countries. Not now, but some time ago, like 80s and 90s. And would this work? It may, actually. If you look at the theory more carefully, I'm not going through here, but if you go to graduate school, then you will learn about it. But there is a theory. But then the theory basically goes that it may work in both ways. Okay, lots of economics theory is like that. But anyway, so it may increase the employment level at one condition. It may decrease the employment level on the other condition. Okay, why? Because there are problems. First thing is that for technical reasons, some firms may not increase the employment level, at least in the short run. Why? Let's say the machine and workers are, let's say, complements, perfect complements. Okay, so even if the worker they have to pay higher wages, they simply cannot increase the number of workers. Okay, so that is possible. So increase of employment may not happen to every firm. even if you enforce this. Second, when they increase number of workers, they have to incur the adjustment costs. There is an additional cost, not only the overtime premium. So if this cost is high enough, the firms may not increase the employment level at all. They just pay higher wage per worker. If, let's say, it requires, let's say, very skilled and workers to work in this job. So you cannot just hire new people and expect them to do the same quality of work as your existing employees. Okay? So it may be more counterproductive, actually. So in that cases, they will just bear the higher cost, but not increase the new hires. Okay? So in very skilled jobs, it's not likely to, it's not that easy to find skilled workers. Okay? Third thing, in the long run, obviously this policy increases the labor cost overall. Basically makes labor more costly, right? So in the long run, what we can think is that the firms probably try to substitute capital for labor, okay? So if they, do it, then they can do it. So at the end, this work sharing may increase labor demand, but it may not increase labor demand. It is even possible it may actually decrease labor demand. Okay, it is possible that even in the short run, okay, no, not really in the short run. In the long run, what can they do is not only they substitute, they can, just because of the scale effect, they may reduce the employment level. So there is a theory that it may work both ways. It may increase or even decrease the employment level. It's not clear which way. So there has been empirical studies about it. There is a lot of studies comes from Europe, actually. Some look at France, Germany, Canada. What country? I think I have seen a study about Portugal. And lots of studies. Okay, what is the verdict? Not sure. The empirical evidence is mixed. Some studies I have seen are very negative, but not very negative. Some studies I have seen is that it says that basically there is no effect. So work sharing does not increase employment level. And in some cases, it decreases employment level. Okay? In some cases, it increases employment level for a small portion. So at the end, I think the general consensus among economists is that this policy is not likely to work very well. Okay? So if your objective is to increase employment level by reducing the number of regular hours, it's not going to work much. Okay? The evidence so far is not very supportive about it. It's not a magic, it's not a magic wand. You just wave it and then you can have more people employed. It's not going to happen much that way. It's much more complicated. So I think, yeah, if you go to our textbook, page 132, there is work sharing in Germany. There is one study about work sharing in Germany. So, in summary, this is a well-known study. Actually, it's published in some very good journal. And what it says is that the reduction in the standard work week, so it happens in 1984 to 1994. So in Germany, the reduction in the standard work week reduced the average number of hours worked weekly and increased the average wage rate, but total employment declined. What about in Korea? In Korea, actually, we tried a similar thing. In the from 2004, I think, for the the Korea's standard work hours now? How many hours? Huh? In a week, what is the standard hours in Korea? Work hours? It's mostly, for most workers, it's 40 hours. It's not for all, but 40 hours is for you guys, it's likely to be 40 hours, okay? If you work in real small shops, it's not 40 hours. It's still 44. But it used to be 44 hours, okay? But actually by the changing the Labor Standard Act, I think it started in 2004. They changed gradually to 40 hours per week, okay? So it's reducing the standard number of hours, okay? They started it with very large companies, and they extended the law to smaller and smaller and smaller. Now I think it's extended to employers hiring 5 or more. But for very small, it's still 44. So there has been some studies about the effect of this reducing the standard work week in Korea on employment. There are not many studies. One thing is it's very difficult to study the effects. Okay, it's not that easy. If you really try to seriously do it, it's not that easy. Okay, I'm not telling you why, but I tried, and it's very difficult. Second, the finding so far is that it does decrease work hours, okay. The salaries of the workers did not change much. So even if you work for 40 hours, previously 44, the employer did not reduce the wage rate, basically. It did not reduce the salary, total salary. So it means that your hourly wage rate has increased because you work short hours. So it's like Germany, right? How about the total employment? That's the part that it's very difficult to get the estimate. And one study is that it decreased the new hires. Okay, there is some study that says it decreased new hires. But I'm not going to say that that is the story, because there has been some problems with that study, so I'm not very sure whether it's the real effect. Okay, but the thing is that even in Korea, we do not have very strong evidence that supports that reducing work week from 44 to 40 increased the employment level. Okay, probably did not happen. Okay, what happened was that 40-hour work week seems to increase the quality of life for workers. Okay, they are generally happier. Okay. Okay, I think we finished today at this moment, and we will start our discussion on labor market equilibrium from Wednesday. Okay, see you on Wednesday.